Hello again, you beautiful people. This is our third episode in our special series from Forever Classic Games, the Zach Snyder Cut. I'm your host, Zach Snyder, and with me as always are Alex McCumber and Joe Seamson. How are you all doing today?
Pretty alright, man.
Doing pretty good. I got new pants.
He did get new pants.
Fancy pants?
I've been calling them hot pants. They're pretty nice.
They're really nice. This has been a lifetime of Goodwill, garage sale, and Target/Walmart pant shopping for me. And today I went to like a legit place and got like nice pants that actually fit me for the first time in my whole life. And it's pretty nice. I'm hot now.
You're a brand new man.
Aww.
Got new pants. In my world, I guess the biggest thing is I just wrapped up a like little special project that I can't talk about yet, but it involves Chrono Trigger, and like the person I submitted it to was super excited about it. So
That's always good to hear.
I'll talk about it when it's available. But I can kind of close that chapter. I've played so much Chrono Trigger in the past, like, month and a half.
I bet.
I'm a part of this project as well, but I won't go into too many details about it because I don't want to reveal more than necessary.
Right on.
All right. Well, today we're going to go ahead and continue our journey once again through director Zack Snyder's filmography. And what we're going to do today is his third major film, The Watchmen. How do you all feel about The Watchmen?
Well, so it's one of those things that was kind of built up to be this really special event. I remember it being a far bigger deal than it feels like now. And I think it kind of all hinges on just how much people enjoyed that graphic novel. And so when this movie came out, and I think I like half-heartedly watched it, a friend of mine loaned me the comic, and I read the comic, and I'm like, I get why people like this, but I don't understand what's going on.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat.
It's dense.
So,
it's such a dense, like, high-concept approach to superheroes for the time, especially.
yeah, actually, I did feel that at the time. It was completely new and like a whole new depth for me when I realized that's what the movie was going with. I wasn't quite mature enough to really get a good grasp of it, but hey, it's what it was.
And the movie doesn't really capture that tone that we see in the graphic novel as well as one would like. And I feel like for a lot of people, this movie was kind of a disappointment, especially if you were a big fan of that original work. But it's, looking back on it, it's not terrible. Like, some of the imagery, at least, is pretty spot on and almost like shot for shot with the comic.
Yeah.
So for me, when I first watched this movie in theaters, and I had not heard of the graphic novel until after I saw it. And when we left the theater, my friend was like, "Oh, you should read the graphic novel. It's really good." And then that was the first time I read the graphic novel. Then it was just kind of like, I remember a lot of things from my reading of the graphic novel. I don't really remember a lot of things from that time of watching the movie. I had to watch the movie again later to like remember things from it. I remember some of the like jarring tonal, like some of the editing is kind of like jarring in tone. Like you go from like an intimate scene that's kind of hokey and a little bit silly to suddenly someone's getting their arms like cut off in a prison riot. And it's just like, that's what I remembered of the movie. I didn't remember things like what even the plot was. I had to read the graphic novel to understand the plot.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I definitely like had to not only read the novel, but also look up what people were saying about it, because I didn't quite understand it.
Now, when you all first heard of Watchmen, what did you think? Like, before we knew any of this, or before your rewatch of it, what were you thinking coming into it?
The reason this was kind of like presented to me, and granted, I was introduced to this as a teenager, and so anything edgy with, like, you know, lots of graphic violence and sex was kind of a big deal to us back in the day. And so a friend of mine was like, there's this character named Rorschach who is incredible. And he, like, kind of pitched me the character and how he's, like, this hardened noir, like, hero that, like, runs around punching dudes and breaking faces. And that's kind of what led me into it. And I still think that Rorschach might be the best part. I just don't like him as a character anymore. And I see him more as a villain than a hero, for sure.
He's kind of an anti-hero. He has his sense of justice, and he does not sway from what that means. even in the face of like evidence to maybe suggest that he should look the other way at one point or change his tactics a little bit. He's like, evil doesn't change how they do things. Evil is evil. It's always evil. Why do the good guys have to make compromises? And so you kind of end up with this villainous justice guy. I don't know. It's a little bit compared to like probably the Punisher is the closest.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Is I always compared him to like a Punisher or like a more morally ambiguous Batman, like in those veins of things, but being the like almost less successful version of them because, you know, he gets fucking poofed.
Right. So leading up to it, like I remember my friends being like, have you seen The Incredibles? And I was like, well, yeah. And they were like, well, The Watchmen is the comic that inspired The Incredibles. And now this is the movie adaptation of that comic. And I would say that's a pretty accurate look at it. But much more adult oriented themes, a lot more violent. But the story, the core of it is the same. Superheroes have been outlawed, and due to some sort of recent event, they are now coming back into play after being dormant for so many years.
Yeah, and I do gotta say, like, with Rorschach specifically, the actor Jackie Earle Haley does a tremendous job capturing that character.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think he's probably one of the acting highlights of the movie.
I would also say he's probably the most accurate to the comic, too, in terms of theme and characterization.
Mm-hmm.
I can agree to that.
So I guess, Zach, like, were you as familiar with these, like, characters and stuff, or was the movie was kind of like your introduction as well?
The movie was my introduction, and I had no fucking clue what was going on.
Yep.
Like, I was coming into this movie like, cool, superhero movie. Where's it from?
What's that feller doing with his dong out?
Yeah, pretty much. It was like, well, that's a big blue naked man there. All right.
So, which raises the question is, for the longest time, the reason why the original author was willing to sell some of his works was because he didn't think it was possible to even make them into movies. And it was kind of like, oh, you're going to give me a bunch of money for the movie rights to my story that's a story that's impossible to turn into a movie? Okay, bunch of dumbasses. Thanks for the free money. Only, come 2009, in that era, they take like 3 of his books and make them into movies. In terms of like walking away from it, being confused, like you didn't really understand the story or the plot or like the point, maybe he was right.
Maybe it shouldn't have been turned into a film.
Possibly.
It's such a dense read. And it's one of those things that I remember it took me like a long time to even get through, like just a surface level reading of it. But it is one of those books that, like me and Joe, whenever we sat down to watch this movie, he's like, oh, did you know there's like a symmetry thing going on in the entire book? I'm like, what? And so there's like these weird little details that I keep discovering about the Watchmen. And I think that those characters do show up in other comic works. And, of course, now we have the HBO series that kind of carries on the story from the film.
Yeah.
And it's been hailed as, like, way better than the Snyder film by a lot of, like, comic nerds.
That's good. All right, so after having watched the film, what do you think were some of the highs and lows of it?
The highs for me were definitely, like, visually, this movie is some of his strongest work, like, for Zack Snyder. Like, he really captures the essence of it, I think, really well. I think that some of the action sequences are really well done. The low points for me is it really doesn't understand the point of the original comic. The point of The Watchmen is that superheroes, if they were real, kind of suck.
And would be terrifying.
They're not good people. Yeah, it'd be terrifying. It would be horrible. Like, basically on the whim of individuals, they could control entire events of the world. It's like supposed to be like a warning story, like, or like something scary. It's supposed to be like very like kind of depressing. And the Watchmen movie, directed by Zack Snyder, is like, superheroes are fucking badass. Look at them do all this cool shit. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then like coupled with like hyper violence, which does not reflect the comic at all. The comic actually doesn't have, it has some like intense imagery, but it's not like, look at this person, like arms being chopped off and all this blood all over the place.
Yeah, there's definitely some gore in the original comic, but this kind of like pushes the boundary quite a bit. I would say aside from Rorschach, I really enjoyed the like relationship dynamic between Night Owl, Silk Spectre, and of course on the outer edge of that, Dr. Manhattan. So it's interesting because like Dr. Manhattan kind of got with him as like a fling, and of course he's like this otherworldly being that's just so above humans that of course he eventually loses touch with her. And so she ends up reconnecting with Night Owl, and I thought that like that whole dynamic was just really interesting and not something that we see a lot of in superhero films, especially of the era, and even now like it's kind of a rare, complex thing. And I like how Night Owl like has all these echoes of Batman. So you like he's got his apartment, and underneath he's got like his ship and abandoned suits of various ages, and I don't know, it's kind of cool. And of course like some of the well choreographed action scenes involve Spectre and Night Owl, and those are of course just kind of entertaining to watch. But like Joe's saying, they do completely miss the point of the original tone of the story.
Yeah, so for me, I did enjoy the like noir feel when Rorschach was involved in anything. His like way of analyzing things and how it was brought across on screen was really interesting for me. Coming from just I'm watching this movie and checking out how this film's going, because this is pre me having been in theater doing any kind of acting of any kind. So it was just a really interesting something to me, especially at the time. And I want to say this was around the time of like Jerry Bruckheimer being really big with like the CSIs and other like TV show hits. So that I feel there's a lot of familiar camera movements going on when I'm drawing comparison to them. So everything felt familiar, but was like this new, dark, gritty thing.
I think it's cool that just noir as a genre pops up a lot in this movie, and that's definitely like, it's such a cool, distinctly noir moment, but it's not the like main goal of the movie. So you get this like mix of, oh, this is, you know, grandiose sci-fi stuff, and then here's this like really down-to-earth, minute noir section.
Yeah. And I think that's what I liked a lot about the movie. Other than it was really pretty looking, it was dark. I really like that kind of dark fantasy thing.
The special effects for Dr. Manhattan still look great.
Yeah.
And that's because that like the way they did it was kind of like, it just made sense.
So the breakdown of that is what you see on screen, like Dr. Manhattan himself is a CG VFX compositing. But the lighting effect, the light that he casts on everything around him, that's practical. The actor wore an LED lit suit. So wherever he walked, he was actually casting blue light on everything.
That's really nifty.
And that really impacted how well he fit into the scene. It's a really genius piece of like VFX compositing and combining it with practical effects, because it really works. I'm totally sold that there's a glowing blue man in the middle of the screen, surrounded by real people. Even though he's completely a VFX fabrication, the fact that his actual light is being cast in real life really helps sell that lighting and that like his weight in the scene.
For sure. So I guess the only low that I had for the most part was I didn't understand what was going on, and I felt it was paced kind of weird. Lots of stuff was like, you were mentioning earlier, like scene to scene was kind of like whiplashy depending what was going on. And I just couldn't make super head nor tails of what was the reason why to the conclusion.
It kind of assumes that you're familiar with at least the original comic.
Yeah, in some degrees. Part of the problem is that it's almost too faithful to the story beats of the comic. When you're looking at all the individual issues, it'll end on a certain point, and then the next one will start up at a different point. But you have that like separation, or that the benefit of like it being separated into issues or chapters. So you kind of have an ending to a chapter and a beginning of a new chapter. You don't really get that with film. So where Zack Snyder, I think, could have like finessed that a little bit more is the flow of those scenes, so that when you transition between different parts of the story, it makes a little bit more sense on screen. But it's almost too faithful to itself, and what you end up with is where one chapter ended, the next one starts up, and it's totally different intention and tone than the previous issue was.
Yeah. So having said all this, what do you all think about the film as a whole? Like ups, downs, lefts, rights, after having watched it again?
So I think it's important to note that we don't know what cut of the movie we watched, and there's like 3 or 4 different ones.
I think we watched the theatrical cut, but there is like an ultimate and a director's cut as well.
Yeah, so we're really kind of basing this on what's currently just available on HBO as a part of the like DC movie package. And so some of the like critiques and stuff that we have of this movie might not actually be connected if you're watching a different version. And that's something that I think we thought about whenever planning this particular special, but we really wanted to focus on like the Justice League and how the Snyder Cut's going to be like, you know, this crazy different thing. And maybe we'll revisit it one day, but I think it's just important to note that like there's differences between versions, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Joe, what about for you?
I think overall, I still like it. I think I enjoyed it more this time than I originally did, now that I've read the graphic novel almost annually for the last like 10 years. And then I'm finally going back and watching the movie for like the second or third time. I think it's also interesting that now that I have a greater understanding of it and a little bit more of the like background of it, in an interview a while back, Dave Gibbons, who was the artist for the graphic novel, said that as it progressed, Watchmen became much more about the telling of the tale itself. The main thrust of the story essentially hinges on what is called a MacGuffin or a gimmick. So really the plot itself is of no great consequence. So that also plays into the part, I think, that people walk away from the movie confused, because even the original is a little, we don't really care about how good the story itself is. We care more about how the story is told. And I think that's part of why it stands out as a graphic novel, is because they really went in deep in breaking some of the rules and creating new rules of comics and graphic novels and pushing the limits of the time of the medium.
So I guess compared to other Snyder films that we've already watched and ones that I've watched that I know are coming up, this one is definitely not my favorite, but I like some of the imagery that's in this film, and I really enjoy the fact that this movie inspired a bunch of people to go to that comic.
Yeah.
And that's a comic that really challenges the reader. And so I think that just setting up comic readers to be challenged is an interesting dynamic that paved the way for more interesting comics.
Yeah, it's also interesting because the movie doesn't have the story within the story. When you're reading the graphic novel, there's a basically a series of comics in the world of Watchmen. What is it called?
It's kind of like a sea pirate thing where they're like stranded at...
Yeah, it's like a pirate story, but that is missing from this adaptation, but it was provided as a separate thing. There was a animated feature, direct to video supplement that you could get as well to watch that kind of filled in that part of the graphic novel. We have not watched that, but it's Tales of the Black Freighter, and it's the story within the story, and it has a lot of parallel storytelling within it to the main plot of Watchmen. There's also a lot of other like supplemental things and additional pieces to the graphic novel that you just don't get the insight that is provided in other mediums, because the graphic novel is just so well made and thought out that it really just kind of fill out everything that you kind of need and creates this very approachable world, despite being superheroes not being real, if that makes sense.
And it being a world that is all about suffering. Like the
true.
depiction of the universe that we get in The Watchmen is very sad and somber and tragic. And so even despite that, it's a fun read somehow. I don't think it's perfect. Even the original comic book, despite its really cool features and this and that, I still don't think it's a perfect thing, but it's so fascinating, and it's the type of read that when you're done, it makes you think, and you're like, huh, and the next time you read it, you might get something else, and that's cool. That's all the best literature in the world really benefit from multiple viewings or replayings or whatever.
That's true. And for me at the end, having watched it again, I think that I was still really stuck on the jarriness of it, because it would take me out of being really into the zone.
Yeah, you're suddenly very aware that you're watching a movie.
Yeah.
Because of the sudden change in tone.
Right. And they were not done as well as, other superhero movies that do that cut to another event, which is what I think they were aiming for with, like you were saying, the splits to the chapters. But I don't think it was done well enough to, put that on a billboard with no lights, new chapter, new stuff going on.
Right. Well, even in a lot of other movies, they'll do like an establishing shot. So like they'll give you like, oh, we're in a new place now, and this is what's happening here, and then you see the plot. In Watchmen, you go from being deeply centered on a character moment, and then suddenly you're in the middle of a different character's moment in a totally different place.
Yes.
And it's confusing because you don't get that establishment break between those conditions.
And a lot of times that it happened, I thought that I was in that character's memory or that character's thought. So I didn't think... There's a lot of the movie that I was confused on what's real, what's happening, and what did happen before.
There's a lot of aspects that we didn't even get to either in this conversation, because the movie and the comic is also kind of funny. Like, there's a very dark sense of humor in various points, especially towards the end. But I think that at the end of the day, would we recommend people check this one out?
I would say I'm glad this movie was made. I don't think that this will be a movie that a lot of people will be overly happy with. From me.
I think I enjoyed it more than Dawn of the Dead, but I think it's just because I'm very familiar with the original work now.
And Dawn of the Dead is very much a genre piece, so if you're not into that genre as much, it makes sense.
That's true.
I would say maybe at the very least check out a couple scenes from this film, and if that interests you, check out the graphic novel. Where I think people will really have a good time is that new HBO series. I've seen the first few episodes, and I really liked what it was doing.
They are very good. Yeah, I think the graphic novel is a must read. Absolutely. If anyone's interested in getting into comics, it's self-contained. It's one thing. You don't have to worry about reading 200 issues or getting lost in the middle of it. It's pretty easy to get a hold of. It's affordable, and it's really, really well done.
So then, what are your final thoughts on it? Like, Alex and Joe, like, what do you think final, having wrapped up for everybody else? Because we're already heading down that path anyway.
300, I think, is more entertaining. And definitely, like, a more fun movie for just, like, a movie perspective. This, I think this struggles with the source material and it being a movie because the original story just benefited so greatly within its medium.
I think I agree with the assessment that 300 is a more entertaining movie. I think Zack Snyder was a good choice for 300. And the reason I think that is 300 is a simple story, and Zack Snyder just took that simple story and added so much personality to it. The Watchmen is a very complicated story, and it doesn't really matter how much you add to it. You don't really clear anything up by adding more. And I think that's where it gets lost. I will say, so far, this is the movie that has the least Snyderisms. Like, there's slow-mo, but it's more similar to other superhero slow-mo moments. The color grading is appropriate. I think because of the effects required for Dr. Manhattan, he had to go with a more like realistic coloring with some like definitely brought in the blacks more, so it's like darker, but it's nice to look at. It's the most like color correct of the movies we've seen so far. It just kind of like comes together pretty well. So it stands out in his filmography in that way.
Yeah, I think for me, I catch a lot of Zack Snyder, the director's isms, I guess you would say. So the things we've seen him do before, some key slow-mo moments.
Yeah. They're here, but they're done differently than they had been done up to this point.
Yes, I think they fit better in here. I don't know if I would say that they were done better. I just think that they fit this much better.
Fair enough. Yeah. No, they like when it goes to the slow-mo moments, you aren't as hyper aware that you're suddenly in slow-mo.
Nope, you're just hyper aware that Dr. Manhattan has his dong out in slow-mo.
Or that, there's some very violent things happening on screen, but you don't really register that it's like suddenly slow-mo like you do in like 300.
Now slow-mo gets real impressive in our next film, and I'm really excited about that.
True. So yeah, and I guess my final thoughts are it's a fun movie to watch once. It's jarring for me, so I couldn't really like dive in deep to it, and I'm still confused about a lot of stuff having not read the source material. I don't know what the overall like major importance of the comedian was, even though he's used in a lot of like the ad features for the movie. Like, I don't know what superpower he had that made him part of this like big thing, other than maybe he did some stuff to innocent people in a war. I don't I couldn't gather a whole lot more about his backstory.
I think his superpower was lack of morality.
That could have been it.
He pulls the trigger.
It was what it was. I would say watch it, take it in. If you fall into love with it like Joe did, keep doing it, seek more. If you don't like it, like Alex said, you should probably still read the material, because from what they're saying, it's excellent. I don't know, but I hear that from a lot of people, though.
I think overall, Zack Snyder had his work cut out for him in adapting this to a movie, because Alan Moore intended this to be something people would read 4 or 5 times and get something new out of it every time. That's how much thought was put into this.
Definitely a challenge.
And to turn that into like a movie, even if it is almost 3 hours long, is a challenge.
So what do we got coming up next then, Zach?
So next time, make sure that I tell you the movie title 100% correctly, because I have a tendency to jack that up. It's Superman Man of Steel, or is it just Man of Steel?
No, our next film is Legend of the Guardians, The Owls of Ga'Hoole.
Oh, shit.
And then after
Yeah,
that,
that's
we
a couple
got
movies
Sucker
away.
Punch. Then we go into the DC stuff again.
I skipped like a whole bunch of stuff, but those were awesome. One is nice and trippy, but our next one is pretty and really, really fun to me.
Yeah, I actually like this one a lot. We'll talk about that in depth on the next episode.
We will.
Yep.
And so for everybody out there, if you're interested in seeing more of our work, head over to foreverclassicgames.com. If you want to hear more of what we're doing, come check us out. We're the Forever Classic Podcast on anywhere that you can catch us. Most podcatchers have us. If not, tell us. We'll figure out a way to put ourselves there. And I'll also be confused how you found it. But that's it, guys. Have a good day. Thanks for enjoying this episode 3. And next time we'll be back with The Owls of Ga'Hoole.
Joe's got hot pants.
Wow.
Ooh.